Today's guest was featured on episode 31. The title was Great Loss Brings Great Awareness. We touched on some personal tragic events and the topic of consciousness. Today's guest is an expert in ancient history, mythical language, and shaman tradition, and the science of consciousness. Author of Merchants of Light and the Miracle of Death, There is Nothing But Life. I'd like to welcome Dr. Betty Kovacs to the show.
Thank you, Dylan. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for being on again. And it's nice to have you on. It's one of my probably personal favorite conversations I've ever had with anybody on this show. So I'm real excited about, kind of getting into the topic of consciousness. I think it's something it's talked about, but I don't know if it's talked about enough, especially in like mainstream. But I think one thing that you had said, and I believe in our last interview, your son had shared it with you, or, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I thought it was a great quote. And it was, birth and death are nothing but moments in time and space, and that consciousness continues.
Yes, that's a basic theme, really, that we see throughout shaman mystic cultures, and also that my husband and I experienced with our visionary experiences after our son died with him. And we knew that to be true, once we were experiencing his consciousness, and there were so many indications and ways of checking and proving it was him. First of all, we just knew it, because if you know someone, you're with that person. But yes, it's just birth and death are events in time and space, and there's nothing but life, nothing but conscious life that continues.
And with that being said, I think that kind of belief system, and I truly believe that too, but I think it should give humanity or people hope. And I've talked about this on my show before. My listeners may even, I don't know, get tired of me saying this, but I think, like, especially in the times we live in now, where everything is so fear driven, and just to know that, like, death is just an experience and that we continue on, and there's really no reason to fear, right?
No, I think not the actual crossing from the material dimension into the subtle world or spiritual dimension. No, I think what I wish that we could do as a culture is learn more about how to take care of the body so that people don't have to go through such pain as they prepare for death, but the actual crossing, no.
Excellent. So has there been anything new you're currently working on, or what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Oh, well, I am working on another book with a man from Japan. And he's actually French Canadian, but he's lived all of his adult life in Japan. He teaches in a university there. And he had watched, I think it was Spiritual Renaissance, a film made by Anthony Chen. And he had this connection, that we should work together. And he was very much involved with John Dee and the mysticism and symbols that John Dee brought forth. And John Dee was like a magician and a philosopher, mathematician, and advisor to the first Queen Elizabeth. And he participated in the science mystic awakening, you might say, almost preparing for it. So he is working on one of the symbols that he says he's certain is for helping all of us to awaken that visionary ability. So it was very interesting, because when we talked, I had this, I started remembering something. And after our son died, Pishti, when we were having these visions, there was another voice. It wasn't Pishti's, actually, I think, but it was just this one sentence: a soul from the East will come to you. And I thought, what does that mean? But in all these years, I didn't know. And I thought of a soul uh, from the other side. But when I was talking with him, I felt very certain that that was who he is. and he had felt something like that, I think, when he watched the film. And so we're going to work on this, and it's going to be sort of bringing together ancient wisdom for younger generations, and we'll see where it takes us. It's one of those experiments that you kind of know you're to do it, and as he writes a chapter, then I write a chapter, and we sort of allow it to happen. So it's kind of an interesting experiment.
That sounds like a very interesting book. When's it the projected date, or do you guys have any kind of timeline for when you're trying to release it?
Not yet, but I can let you know when it does
Yeah,
come out.
yeah,
Yeah,
please do.
I will.
So, have you had any more experiences from the other side since we last spoke?
Not like I did in the years after the deaths. That was very clear and precise, and I had no doubts. Certainly, while I was in the vision, I had to overcome my own university scientific training that there's nothing, there's no meaning, no purpose, and when you're dead, you're dead. And I never believed that. I hoped it wasn't true. I didn't know. Consciously, I always held the hope that it wasn't true, but I wanted to find out everything I could. But that, I didn't accept that. But I realized during these powerful visions that I had been brainwashed without knowing it on a subconscious level. Because when I was in the vision, I knew. And then when I would come back to ordinary consciousness, that left brain, that rational mind, that trained by the university, would jump in and try to question everything. And it took a while to deal with that, because without my consciously accepting it, in the university, they really assume our culture, our whole culture assumes that the left brain, rational, conceptual thinking is all there is. It's superior to any other thing that goes on in any other brain component. And we've just developed just that left rational conceptual brain. And we've ignored and made fun of the symbolic brain, which is the right brain. But now we know that that right brain exists, some do, and we know that it is our first language because it speaks to us in symbols. So it's symbolic language. So I would say that, well, first of all, I should say the first and great theorist of symbolic language was John Battista Vico. And he said this, and even, imagine that was in the 1700s. And he said that the first language is symbolic, and that particular brain component must never be reduced to the rational. The rational develops after, later than the symbolic. And it's the symbolic brain that feeds the rational and gives it logic. He said symbolism is not without logic. It has a poetic logic because of the symbols, but it feeds the rational brain. And of course, we love to work with anything rationally to see what we can figure out in that language. So he said the rational must never be reduced to the symbolic. There must be an integral and dynamic continuum of movement between the symbolic and the rational and symbolic. One should never be cut off. It should be that wonderful relationship. And he said, in this way, the mind can experience its own wholeness. So to bring that back to your question, I don't experience them in the way that I did after their deaths, but I feel that presence, and I feel that they guide me in a lot of ways. I think they aren't the only ones, but I do feel their presence in my life and guidance, but it's not the way it was right after their deaths. That was so vibrant and real and extensive.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I'm sure we could probably sit here all day and talk about the reasons why mainstream science is maybe ignored or just looked at, academia has looked at, just I don't know what the word is, but they just look at logic, right? Like you were saying. Is it perhaps because it's not as easy to quantify or to like put in a box with numbers kind of thing in a nice, neat category? You can't really, I don't know.
No, I think you're right. You're on the right path there because, but that's partly because we have only dealt with the rational brain since the late 1600s.
Mm,
We've that's all we've dealt with, and there is a deeper reason why we did only work with the rational brain. In 1600, there was a real awakening of mystical experience, and there were men and women, but we know mainly about the men who were scientists and they were mystics. John Dee was one of them. And they're trying very hard to bring these worlds together, to have the experiences and then to rationally think about them. They are the ones who brought mathematics in as a way of analyzing nature. So they were brilliant, and they were also mystics. And they actually did get some political power. But when they did, then the church started watching them. And what had happened was that they were in Prague, called the old Bohemia, and all of these traditions that had to be undergrounded because culture wouldn't allow these mystics to have too strong a voice. But all of these organizations like the Hermetic arts, Kabbalah, mystic Christianity, alchemy, they all went into Prague because Rudolph, who was the leader, that was Catholic, but he himself was open and resilient and flexible because he had interest in that himself. Well, they lasted for 20 years. And in 1620, the church just destroyed them. And they destroyed the church, destroyed all of their manuscripts that they could get their hands on, and probably took some to the Vatican, we don't know, destroyed cities, and even in Heidelberg, where some of them came from, destroyed that beautiful city, so built by engineers and philosophers and mystics. So that was destroyed. Then there was the 30 Years' War between the Catholics and the Protestants. After that was over, these scientists, some of whom had also been the mystics there, went to England and they formed the Royal Society for the Study of Science. That was in 1660. But they could not study anything but matter because they would either be killed by the church or their reputation would be ruined. Because during these 30 years, this group of scientists and mystics had been caricatured, made fun of. The propaganda was horrible about them, like that they lied, they did, they had horrible propaganda against these scientists and mystics who were also forming, in part, this new Royal Society.
wow.
But they had learned over the 30 years, you can only study matter. Later, scientists didn't know that. They forgot. There's only matter, but they never developed any tools to study anything but matter.
So that's basically essentially the origins of how we kind of got on this path of studying matter.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. Now, what are the reasons behind the church doing this? Was it to take back the power? Did they feel like they were maybe gaining too much power, or was it just because it was going against the church's narrative in some way? Or
going against the church's narrative. From the beginning, the church would not accept as Christian those early Christians who experienced this higher consciousness. They're called Gnostics, and the church called them heretics. But they were actually people who did not want to settle with believing in something. They wanted to experience that consciousness, that is, altered states or higher levels of our consciousness. I think last time I might have talked about how Huxley, and I think before him Bergson, then Aldous Huxley said, we're all born out of cosmic consciousness, but there's a valve that limits it so that we can do what we're doing right now, and go shopping and cook dinner and so on. But our ancestors knew how to release that valve so that that larger consciousness could flow through. And that's what the church did not want, because once we had these vast experiences, we were not likely to adhere to a limited doctrine about who we are. And so they were always after the mystics. There were some great mystics later in the Catholic Church. Some of them almost got kicked out of the church, but there were within the church, there were. But we now know that Jesus actually was a mystic. He was a shaman mystic, and he taught people rituals or experiences of how to release that valve. That was called the hidden tradition that Jesus taught. The church wanted none of that because they could control us better. You know, if we don't know who we are, if we think we're limited in the way that we're told, we can be controlled.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very well said. Going on kind of the, you mentioned mystics. What role do you believe that maybe ancient philosophy or philosophers played? Maybe people like Aristotle, Confucius, even John Locke. What kind of role did that play in us understanding consciousness better?
Well, maybe I could go back just a bit. There's a wonderful scholar, Peter Kingsley, and he writes about the pre-Socratic philosophers. They came earlier than Plato. They really came from Anatolia, Turkey, and then went into southern Italy. But Parmenides was, well, Pythagoras was also a pre-Socratic philosopher, deeply versed in Egyptian mysticism and ritual and mathematics and science. Parmenides also, they were an incredible group of shamans. We never knew that before, that they were actually shaman mystics who were also mathematicians, diplomats, politicians, ambassadors, chemists, and logical thinkers. I mean, it was an amazing group of people. And Parmenides did have a relationship with Plato. But Plato, according to Kingsley, reduced that vast shaman mystic tradition into a rational tradition. And that caused a big change in Western culture, Western civilization. Now, tell me your question. did I go too far with
No,
the pre-Socratics?
that was good. It was just, what kind of role did did philosophy play
Yes.
on us understanding consciousness?
Yeah, that's very important, because philosophy, earlier philosophy before Western philosophy influenced by the rationality of Plato, that philosophy, of course, was about experiencing who we are. And then later, as it became more rational in Western thought, it was a different kind of thing. It was a philosophy of thinking. Philosophy in the West is so rational, you just about lose your mind sometimes. But before then, philosophy was about the mystical inner tradition and logical thinking about it. But in the West, it became basically logic. But these certainly, all of them played a role, some more to the rational side and others more to the mystical side. And the West then became basically rational.
There's a knowing or a like great understanding from these great thinkers and these people, like, you had mentioned that, they had a good understanding of mathematics and things like that. Now, is that perhaps because of their spirituality and being so in touch with source? I mean, I know we we've had great thinkers throughout history, but some of the more mystic and spiritual type of great thinkers just seem to be just so well connected to everything and have like an understanding that's beyond, the average person, I guess.
Yes, and that's really exemplified in earlier history. Let's say even the megalithic, here are all these megalithic monuments we now know all over the world. And they were observatories because these people scientifically knew the precession of the equinoxes, when the solstices came, the equinoxes, and they were they were very knowledgeable scientifically, but they also, they wouldn't, I mean, our scientists would say, well, were they observatories or were they temples? Because they also were temples, but they would never have separated the two. An observatory is a temple. The laws of nature are the laws of the soul. And if we could understand the rhythms that these megalithic temples, observatories reveal to us and live our lives in harmony with those rhythms, then the consciousness would flow more naturally. And we would be able to be, if we are spiritually in touch, we can also be conceptually, rationally, logically in touch. There again, those two minds. They're not, one is not reduced to the other. They are the mind and they flow into each other. So we might know on a deep emotional or perceptual level something, but we like to understand it from a rational level. So it's all one mind, really. And they would never have separated it. The separation came in the West, and we have been severely damaged by that separation and that lack of knowledge of the spiritual or the experiential symbolic mind. And, you know, at the same time, Vico understood that. The Enlightenment, so-called philosophers in France in the late 1600s and in the 1700s, they were saying there's nothing but logic. We are the apex of all intellectuality. You know, we've achieved the top. And they really carried out what the church had already prepared, and that is that there's nothing but logic. Of course, the church didn't know it was going to finally have people who threw the church away too, you know, with this logic. But and so they couldn't control them either. But that has been such a danger in Western culture, because Western society, because we have culled out and denigrated all aspects of the mind that give us a larger sense of who we are. For instance, the heart. We now know that the heart is a brain component. It gives more signals to the brain than the brain gives to it. And yet we had no idea that the heart was any more than just an organ to pump blood. But it's actually, in Sufi tradition, the heart is the organ of soul, which if we work with the heart consciousness, we can perceive the spirit world precisely, he said, in a very precise way. It opens us to the subtle world, the spirit world. But we haven't known that in Western culture.
I wonder how one would go about doing that, working from the heart.
You know, I think that we today, all of us, are here to try to rediscover these ways of opening to who we really are, the consciousness that gave us birth. We're learning now that there are techniques, I'm sure, and they're usually far simpler than we think. You know, you think, oh, if it would open me to that, must be very complex. But heart math teaches a meditation that's very simple. It's simply shift your attention to the heart. And they say even you can put your hand on your heart to help you to remember that's where your attention is. And then you breathe in, and as you breathe in, just imagine the heart of the universe. The universe is, you're breathing that universe in through your heart. And then it goes through, you know, all of the brain components, but you're breathing it in through the heart. And to keep the focus on the heart and what you're feeling about everything, it's the feeling that you're focusing on. And that eventually, even if you really want to know something, ask the heart that question. And they say you'll get an answer. It may not be right during that meditation, but later you'll think, oh, that's what that is. You know, it's a very simple thing, but it is helpful. And they've done a lot of studies with children who weren't doing well in school. Sometimes they were aggressive or violent or whatever. They were just kind of out of sorts. And when they went to heart math and they trained in this meditation and worked with them, the children started doing much better in their schoolwork. And they also, those aggressive tendencies were gone. You know, it's just that we haven't known how to anchor ourselves so that we don't kind of go into a bunch of fragments. But the ancients, all the ancient traditions were, it's the heart. And So I don't know. I wish I knew a technique that sounded complicated, but this one I think does help us. I think it just helps us ground ourselves.
That's a great explanation. Um, Moving a little bit forward on great thinkers and people that maybe have influenced kind of how we look at consciousness. In the last interview, you mentioned, I think he's an amazing psychologist, Carl Jung, that his influence on your understanding of consciousness.
Yeah, he was amazing because he brought back to the West the other side that had been omitted. The feeling, the experience. We could think about mystics, but no, we have the ability to experience altered states of consciousness. But he studied the human psyche deeply, and he also went back in history to study it through these underground traditions that actually had experiences, and through myths and fairy tales, because he discovered that these true stories about who we are actually are structured by the organizing principles within the human psyche, that these are laws within us, and they organize these stories. And he saw that all around the world this was happening. There were other people studying this at the same time too. And then he studied the dreams of people. He saw sometimes that he had a patient who had a dream that had symbols very similar to someone who had been an alchemist. And so he really then began to bring all this information together with thousands of patients and dreams, and studying the historical expression of the psyche. And he really saw that the vast potential that we have. He himself had a lot of experiences too that he incorporated in it. But I heard about him, and I don't know whether I mentioned that before or not. I was dating a young man who had just finished Andover Newton, and he'd been given his first church. And so he had a party with other guys from Andover Newton and their girlfriends. And I listened to them talk. I didn't say a word because I knew if I didn't know what they were talking about. They were talking about Carl Jung, whom I had never heard. I think I was a senior in college then, and mathematics and physics and dreams and visions. I just was stunned by it all. And so when they left, I asked him, who is Carl Jung? So he took me into his study, and I borrowed two books. One was Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and I started reading. Sometimes I didn't know what I was reading, but I just kept reading it. And and really it was a lifetime of reading Carl Jung. But I had a dream, sometime after that, after been reading him for a while, that I was out in the forest, totally dark, but I saw a light in a little cabin. And so I went over to the cabin and I knocked on the door, and Carl Jung opened the door. And he had silver hair and this deep red robe, like rubedo in alchemy, that is really the intensifying of the experiences, to the red. And it was just beautiful. Rustic cabin, and there were bookshelves with old ancient texts all covered in leather, and he invited me in. Well, the dream really showed me the condition I was in. I tripped as I crossed the threshold and I flew in on my stomach and landed. I thought the dream has a sense of humor, but I was real clear about the fact I was pretty ignorant. But I showed up at the right place, and he let me in. And then the next scene, we were out on a cement patio, and by the side of the patio was this ancient primeval forest and modern times. And it was interesting because that's what Jung wanted to bring back, the ancient reality of who we are into modern times. But he really did. He gave me hope when I didn't know what was what. He just inspired me and gave me hope. And I really feel he was my mentor, although I never met him.
That's well said. Do you think science is catching up on extending consciousness? And
Yes, exactly. You're right. But an extending consciousness, and you were going to say something else.
Just that, I mean, do you think that, science is catching up on, conscious beyond this meat sack of a suit that we're currently using.
Thank God for quantum physics. And that's what these men were talking about, but I didn't know anything, but I started studying the physics through the perspective of Carl Jung too, because he was very interested in that. But quantum physics in the early part of the last century, they started discovering things that just blew their minds, because it's what had been suppressed. They hadn't studied it before. And it's like science came full circle from those mystics who were suppressed, those science distant mystics. Now it came full circle in quantum physics, because they tried so hard. They went back, the people who were working with that in the beginning, they went back to reading all of these ancient philosophers, but they couldn't put it together. But in the more recent times, of course, it is those really on the edge, you might say, of understanding quantum physics. They know that there are other dimensions of reality. They can't deny that. Whoops, that just shoots materialism out of the picture. Well, I mean, it's still in the picture, but it's only one part of it. And I love what Fred Alan Wolf said. It was a physicist. He said that we learn, matter teaches us that this is the way spirit looks when it comes into the physical world. I love that. And so quantum physicists now, they are saying such things as consciousness is primary. It's first, and it is consciousness that creates matter. As Wolf said, matter teaches us that this is how spirit looks when it comes into the physical world. So it's all spirit, but we're kind of like solidified spirit. And so it's well, Paul Levy, who is a Buddhist and also a writer, he said, we collectively dreamed quantum physics to heal ourselves, because we've been so wounded by the limitations in science and the limitations in religion. So yeah,
Wow,
I think science is catching up.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I love it too.
We collectively dreamed quantum physics,
because we had to heal ourselves of this limited science that was arrogant. Even today, we have quite a group of people who feel that you can't solve any problem except through science. But they had this old, outdated, old-fashioned science from the 1700s. But quantum physics has another story altogether. But these same people who are convinced that science is the only answer and there's nothing but matter, believe we're flawed and they need to make us better, transhumanize us, use AI and nanotechnology and medicines and drugs and so on to make us more. But they
and that
don't
just
know.
feels so wrong, doesn't it? At least to a
Yeah.
spiritual person, myself, at least to me, it feels wrong. It feels like it's the completely wrong direction that we need to go.
Well, I think it's a very unaware direction, because these people do not know that science was censored from the get-go, and they evidently are not looking at quantum physics, and they know nothing about what our ancestors taught us of cosmic universal consciousness that we are capable of experiencing. We can access that. And quantum physics now can see that the human being can access what it is, this universal mind. This group of people, and it's dangerous because they believe they're superior. It's that old illness that comes with split off science, that they are the superior thinkers, the logical thinkers, and we're all flawed. What they don't know is that they're getting that from the inverted myth of the Deuteronomist who wanted to control and wanted to have power over. And this is the same idea. We're flawed and we need to be made something different. And that is today a very powerful and dangerous way of looking at the world.
This is kind of a loaded question, but why do you think there's that struggle is between, materialism and and in consciousness, extended consciousness surviving the bodily death. Why is there this struggle of, one group of people that want power and control, and it's such a difference? And you think, since we're all spiritual consciousness, that we could somehow come together. I mean, is it part of the experience to have this yin and this yang, or this separation, or what? I mean, there's my thing is, I feel like there's got to be a universal reason to why there's always been this separation.
Well, I think that in earlier cultures, there wasn't that separation like today. In the early shaman mystic cultures, I think they experienced the fusion of that. Now, only some continued on and were able to try to understand that experience scientifically. Others didn't. But I thought about that a lot too. That question is a very important question, because we see in Western culture why we have this group that is so in need of power. My feeling is that when we suppress and don't create a civilization that nurtures this potential within us to experience that larger consciousness inside, then we flip and we want our power from the outside. The inner experiences give us empowerment. If we don't have that, then it's flipped. The ego flips outside and then snatches and grabs everything to make itself big and important, because there's that innate knowledge that we are divine. But if we don't find it within, we really then focus on getting it in the outer world, and we become very dangerous, because we feel we must control others, and we're able to think that they're inferior to us. And there's that today too, that we have to get rid of those human beings who are not really worthy, and so that's a real disease. And it's consistent from very early times, when we no longer had a shaman mystic culture in which we would help our children and ourselves to experience this wider consciousness. When that's destroyed, then there is always that illness, that virus, you might say, to have power over, to control, to make others better than they are, to play God. In fact, today they say, we will continue our evolution. We are the evolutionary makers now. This is very, very dangerous, rather than to know that we have the evolutionary potential within us, and our ancestors gave us that blueprint. But that's always destroyed by those who need power. And they need power because they haven't experienced it within, it seems to me.
Yeah, and that's possibly the answer, because they have not experienced the power from within. I struggle so hard to understand that way of thinking, or to understand how someone could get so lost that they would want that kind of power. I mean, one thing I am at least thankful that I'm not that way, because I feel like that would be a horrible existence. But I just want to understand it. Like, how do the people get that lost like that?
I know. And also they're often in positions with a lot of power and money to pull off their illness worldwide.
Well, I think when you have that type of makeup or personality set, I think them positions of power is what they probably seek out,
And how do you get it? And today it looks like a lot of money can help you shape a world that you want, that gives you the
Right.
power. Yeah, it would, there are many of us who, in the beginning, I think of my own life, I didn't know anything. We start out that way, but I knew I wanted to know, and I think that the search saved my life, even though I didn't know it at the time. But the search itself, I was discovering things all along the way, and discovering those things dissolved any desire to have power over anybody. I wanted to know those things. So I think my brother and I used to always ask those questions when we were growing up. And there was a point at which he no longer asked the questions. And I said to him, well, you don't do that anymore. And I'd been in Europe, I came back and we had to talk again. And he said, there comes a time when you just have to make a living and get on with it. And I knew that something had broken in him. And he actually did become an alcoholic. And he was such a beautiful human being. And I know that he couldn't find that meaning. And he just felt he didn't have the time anymore to search for it. And so I think that always makes me so sad, because he was such a beautiful big brother, such a beautiful human being. And he just gave up, that there was something more. And I think that those of us who have the chance to go on, that we need to say what we can, how much we found along the way and what our ancestors, that's what I wanted to know. Well, our culture doesn't teach us much. I couldn't accept religion because I had to believe it, not experience it. I hoped science wasn't right. But when I went back to these earlier cultures, which actually in the last century, many of them were discovered, I thought, yeah, they did know. They did know there was something more. I mean, something vast. In the Nag Hammadi text, these were texts, the kinds of texts that the church burned. But monks at this particular place buried them so they couldn't be burned. And only after the war did we find them. And in these texts, Jesus is a shaman mystic. And he says, I didn't come to save you. He didn't perform miracles or do all of these things. He said, I came to remind you of who you are. And that we're not to follow him, but to become the Christ, a very different person.
See, and that's one of the frustrating things that for me too, is that, I just approach life with an open mind, and I'm willing to shift my ideas if I learn something new or something different.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about is, they learned that Jesus was a mystic and a shaman. But that doesn't, it's not like we go back and we change the text and rewrite the Bible and change the story to a more truthful narrative. We just kind of leave things be. And so I think science itself does that with a lot of things, even when there is proof. I mean, you may have a scientist who's spent his whole life researching and writing books on a particular subject, and when new information comes in, they just want to discredit it. They don't want to introduce it and try to shift their view.
That's so true. And I should have known that, having taught in college. But when I was doing the research, it was sad to see that when something new was discovered, the university would have nothing to do with it. For instance, the cave culture. Here, there was a man who he saw these beautiful paintings, and he had some of the art that it's mobile art. And he said, it's the same age as this. And he said, it's Upper Paleolithic, that far back. And he was laughed at and made fun of, really hurt him deeply. Many people feel that it destroyed him. And those people wouldn't even go look at the cave, but they made fun of him for years. And it wasn't until there were so many people insisting that, yes, it was from that time. And yes, you need to go look at these paintings, that they did. But that is just one example that happened again and again and again, never to accept something new. And I think, are we intelligent if we have to play intelligent and be afraid of anything that can change what we thought was true? No, it's an adventure. We have to be open to what is discovered, and that was very disappointing to see that resistance. And yes, as you say, how many of the churches ever talk about the Nag Hammadi text? Do they? And they act like the Bible is divine. Well, a bunch of men got together and decided, of all the texts that were used in the early stages of Christianity, they would choose these texts. Thank heavens, there were beautiful ones about the life of Jesus, but they weren't complete. And they didn't put things in that really gave us a real good sense of the teachings of Jesus, that we go within and become what he's teaching, what he's talking about. He said, if you drink from my mouth, you and I are one. And I don't know of anyone who goes to church who knows about those texts.
Fascinating. And a lot of these cultures, these ancient cultures you're talking about, are spread all over the world. And did they had similar beliefs, right? Similar ideas of consciousness, and it's almost like an innate knowing, right?
It is, and these cultures had developed, well, from 40,000 BCE, can you imagine? 40,000 BCE, shamanism developed all around the world. And shamanism is a practice that through ritual can trigger altered states. And we know now that some of these rituals actually do create a brain wave that flows through the brain and begins to integrate it. So they were onto something. And usually there would be one in every village who would continually perfect and work with these techniques and help to bring the world of spirit and the world of matter together for people. But they really taught people that, it's one world. That was more than anything else. They wanted to know the laws of nature and live in harmony with them. And so that could open us up to experiencing these things. So it was just amazing that developed all around. And what's also interesting is that Peter Kingsley discovered that from southern Spain all the way through northern Africa and Greece and Crete and all the way through Anatolia, all the way over to India and then to Central Asia, there were shamanic cultures. And he knew that they were connected because of the language patterns. We never knew this. I mean, when I was in school, no one thought that the Greeks knew anything about shamanism. But in fact, the pre-Socratic philosophers before Plato were. But I was just amazed when I thought, here is this whole huge area that we're in contact, and we're shaman mystics. So we've lost something big. And in the book, Merchants of Light, I talk about the cave cultures, and then also the San people of Africa, of the Kalahari Desert. Here, these people, they say they've been there 65,000 years, and we only have evidence of maybe 35,000, but I rather think they know how long they've been there, because they've got these rock art all over the place that is the art of what they've experienced in spirit. But what I wanted to say about them is that they knew how to trigger that rising of that Kundalini energy all the way up through the brain and connect with spirit. And they did it. Their technique was dancing. And they would, majority of women and men are shamans, and they would dance until that happened. And then they experienced cosmic consciousness. And they would dance and touch each other. And even they could take this energy, this sounds strange to the Western mind, and make little arrows or needles of it, and then throw it to someone. And that would ignite that in them. And I thought, well, I wouldn't mind having an arrow thrown at me. But at any rate, here they were, think about it, if they were 65,000 or even 35,000 years, they knew how to do this. Now, they did not create a society in which they had possessions. They really just live in nature, but they have a deep spirituality. And in various other places, people develop different kinds of cultures, but they knew how to keep the world of nature and the world of the soul together so that they could open to it. And that changes everything.
I think that's perhaps one reason why they were so spiritually deep was their connection with Earth.
Exactly.
And,
they all were.
Everything from Earth. And because, I mean, just simple walks out in nature, you just feel so much more well connected. And so you touched on alternative states of consciousness. You were talking about dancing and how they can do that. What are some, like, there's meditation, and then there's like spiritual ceremonies, like with ayahuasca. and like dream states or altered states of consciousness. What is your take on altered states of consciousness? Is it
Well,
just good?
well, I think that what you've said, there are many ways, some people, when they run, they go into an altered state, or swim. I've heard of that too. So it's something in that movement. So is that a form of dancing or repetition that triggers it, that opens it? So I think there are many ways. Now, shamanic cultures, not all of them, but majority of them, for tens of thousands of years, did discover that there were, what they say, they're plant spirits, that we relate to these spirits in the plant, and together we open to a larger consciousness, as in ayahuasca, for example, or mushroom, or so many other things. They did it though with a seriousness. It wasn't, just to kind of hang loose and see what happened. They actually
Well,
took it
yeah,
as a sacred
there
experience.
is a seriousness to it, and there's something about being in that state that opens you up and puts you in touch with something that's much more intelligent than yourself.
Yeah,
It's definitely an odd experience.
it's exactly. And it's a, it's, if the, I was told as a kid, oh, there is an herb for everything on the earth to heal anything we might have. And then when I started discovering about the sacred plants, I thought, this is amazing. And as a mythologist, I mean, they're in Crete, they clearly used mushroom, or they used another drink at the mystery school in Eleusis, and on and on. I thought, okay, if I'm to be a teacher of mythology, am I supposed to teach it and not know the rituals that they actually participated in? So I went to Peru twice and worked with San Pedro, that one sacred plant, and then with others that various cultures have worked with. And it's kind of painful to hear a lot of Westerners talk against it when they don't know anything really about it.
Right.
That this is a sacred ceremony, and that it does open, for some reason or other, it opens that valve, it releases that valve. And when you're in that consciousness, you don't have any questions, and it's a much higher intelligence. And it would be fine if all our politicians had to work with some of
Yes,
these
it would.
before
Yes,
they
it would.
ran for office.
Well, and my thing with it too is, I mean, I know it's getting a little bit of attention now in the medical field, at least psilocybin is, as far as helping against depression and stuff. But
Mhm.
it not only is there like very minimal risk to these kinds of traditions and ceremonies that they do, as far as being harmed, but also there's a healing element to it
Oh,
that's
oh,
emotional, spiritual. It's just there's just something to it. It's kind of like the universe's gifts. I don't know, it's a medicine.
it is a sacred medicine, and it is a gift. And I I think we've been so programmed in the West, well, I'll do it myself. I don't want to use any drugs, but it's just, there's so many, we can't, what do we do alone? I mean, we have to have water to stay alive. And so it seems to me an unknowing position to take. But yes, it
I love that
opens,
example.
it does open us to who we are. And I'm grateful for it. When Pishti died, our son died, we did, I think that in and of itself, it was broke through a lot of barriers, because until that time, I had had some experiences, but not like we had after he died. And we did use, some of the visions came through sacred plants. And but my husband he had kind of not been interested in this until Pishti died. And he he said on the way to work, it was like a tape recorder going. He just felt he was trying to remember everything that he forgot. Something was coming through. So we had visions and dreams without sacred plants. but the sacred plants intensified the experience so profoundly. I mean, he was present, he was there, the spirit was, and the things that, I mean, he talked about the cosmos, about the earth, about what the earth is going to be going through. And it could not be more sacred to have that partnership with nature, with the plant world. It's like nature helping us. And there are spirits in nature, which some people experience. I mean, if only we could open to what is, you know?
Yeah, it's a mysterious world out there, and that I love it. I love it. That's what makes it fun. I got one more question for you, Doc, before I let you off the hook here. Um, what do you believe the goal or the reasons for consciousness is to exist?
Why are we involved in all this anyway?
Exactly.
You know, it seems to me that our ancestors wanted us to know that we are immortal, that we are all divine, and that we're creative. Well, if we're creative, we're creating our world all the time. I had an experience in which I knew that, and then suddenly my personality popped in, and I'm sitting in the woods thinking, but I can't create a world. And a voice came through that was so profound. It said, you just did create a world in which you cannot create. We can do nothing but create. And I thought, think about that. Every time we say, oh, I can't do that, we're creating a condition in which we can't. And so I think it is about our divinity, our beingness. We are creators, and maybe we're learning to create better and better worlds. Who creates the universes? That's consciousness too. If consciousness is primary, it's creating universe. Well, right now, for us, we're learning how to relate to each other, how to love, how to discover who we are. And who knows what kind of creators are existing in the universe. And so maybe we're here in training as creators, but I think also the joy along the way. I mean, even the grief can bring us a deep sense of ourselves and others. So for the experience of it, the experience in and of itself is worthy of our creative energy. But I do think and hope we're learning to be, we're really learning how to truly be creators who use the energy that we have and not use it as I did in that vision to say, well, I can't create a world. Yeah, you can.
That's well said. It's always great having a talk with you. You're just so knowledgeable and you have such a great understanding of things. And where can listeners check out the work you're doing and find your books?
Okay, but I want to say first, it's a great pleasure to talk with you because it gives me hope. And the coming generations, you explore the world, you're going to create a world that you want for your children and for yourself. Anyway, it's Kamlak is the website, KAMLAK.com, and there are lots of videos and interviews and articles and that kind of thing on it, webinars. And you can also buy the books there if you want to. And if you want to join the newsletter, then you get a free chapter sent to you from Merchants of Light. And but any bookstore that sells books and ebooks, the books are available.
Well, stay in touch, Doctor. I'd love to have you back on when your new book releases.
That might be a while, but
that's okay.
Anyway, okay, great.
You're always welcome back anytime.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
See ya.
Take care.